There is an old cast-iron sink sitting in my yard right now, upside down, half buried in a mound of wet clay, and if you walked by, you would think an old man had simply lost something and set it down wrong. But by tomorrow evening, this sink, pulled from a torn-down kitchen, chipped, stained, headed for the scrap pile, will hold fire. It will cook rice, boil water, and warm my hands on a cold Okinawan morning, and it will do this for the next 20 years without ever going back to a landfill. Most people see a broken sink. I see the body of a stove that has not been built yet. My name is Kenji Takara. I am from a small village on Okinawa, near the coast, where my family has built things by hand for generations. I have worked with clay, stone, wood, and fire for over 50 years, since I was a boy, helping my grandfather repair the old earthen Hetsui stove that cooked every meal in our house for as long as anyone could remember. That stove was never bought. It was built and rebuilt from whatever the land and the household gave us. What I am going to show you today comes directly from that tradition. Only now, instead of building the stove's shape from scratch with a wooden form, we let an old sink do that work for us. I want you to understand something about why this trick is not sold to you in any store. A cast iron or steel sink, once it is chipped or stained or the drain has rusted through, has zero resale value to anyone. The company that made it wants it gone, forgotten, replaced with a shining new basin, because a new sink is profit and an old one sitting useful in your yard is not. The wood stove industry, meanwhile, wants you buying a manufactured stove body, welded overseas from thin sheet steel, sold to you for $400, $500, sometimes $800, a stove that will warp and burn through in a handful of hard winters because thin metal exposed directly to fire simply does not survive long. Nobody in that chain benefits from you learning that a 40-year-old cast iron sink, thick and heavy and already built to survive water, heat, and decades of hard use, makes a far better foundation for a wood stove than most of what they are selling you new. So they simply never mention it. It is not a secret because it is complicated. It is a secret because it is too cheap, and it puts the power back in your hands instead of theirs. Now, here is the mistake that ruins this project for almost everyone who attempts it without guidance. They take the old sink, cut a hole in it, shove some wood in, light a fire, and within a week, the metal is glowing red in spots, warping, and the whole thing becomes dangerous rather than dependable. The mistake is this: bare metal touched directly by open flame heats unevenly, expands unevenly, and eventually cracks or warps, no matter how thick and sturdy that old sink feels in your hands. My grandfather's generation understood something modern stove builders often forget. Fire should never touch bare metal directly if you want that metal to last. Fire should touch clay. This is exactly how the traditional Hetsui stoves of Okinawa and mainland Japan were built for centuries. An outer form, often woven bamboo or wood in the old days, packed thick with a mixture of clay, sand, and wood ash, and it was this earthen lining, not the outer shell, that faced the flame. The shell's only job was to hold the shape. The clay's job was to survive the fire. Your old sink is about to become that outer shell, exactly the way bamboo once was, except it will outlast bamboo by decades. So let us begin the way my grandfather always began, slow, deliberate, respecting the material before we ever strike a match near it. Step 1. Prepare your sink. You want a deep sink, ideally cast iron or heavy enameled steel, A farmhouse or utility sink is perfect, the kind with high walls, at least 8 to 10 inches deep. If the enamel coating is chipped or worn, that is completely fine. In fact, it helps the clay grip the surface better later. Clean it thoroughly. Remove the drain assembly and faucet holes if present, and set the sink upside down on a stable, level surface, because for the next stage, the underside of the sink becomes the outer wall of your stove, and the open drain hole, now facing upward, on the bottom of the stove, will later become important for your air intake, so do not plug it shut yet. Step 2. And this is where most people online skip a detail that decides whether this stove lasts 5 years or 50, so stay with me here, is mixing your clay refractory lining correctly, in the same ratio my grandmother used for our family's hetsui, because getting this mixture wrong is the difference between a stove wall that survives 1,000 fires and one that crumbles apart after its first winter. The traditional ratio my grandmother used, and one still used by earthen stove builders across rural Japan today, is roughly this: 1 part clay, 1 part coarse sand, and 1 part sifted wood ash, mixed with just enough water to form a thick, moldable paste, something closer in texture to stiff bread dough than to wet mud. The sand gives the mixture strength and prevents it from cracking as it dries. The wood ash, and this is the part almost nobody outside the tradition knows, contains fine silica and lime that actually improve the mixture's resistance to heat over time, the same way old lime plaster hardens and strengthens with age, rather than weakening. If you cannot find natural clay nearby, you can buy fire clay from a pottery supply store for perhaps $15 to $25 for enough to do this whole project. Or in many rural areas, you can dig your own from a creek bank or subsoil for nothing at all. My own grandfather never once bought clay in his life. Test any clay you dig yourself by rolling a small rope of it between your palms and bending it into a ring. If it holds the curve without cracking badly, it has enough plasticity to work. Step 3. Build your fire chamber form. Before you pack clay into the sink, you need something to shape the empty firebox cavity, the space where the wood itself will actually burn. Use a section of stovepipe, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, sold at almost any hardware store for $10 to $15. Or an old coffee can of similar size if you want to spend nothing. Set this pipe upright in the center of your upturned sink, resting on the drain hole area so the pipe lines up with that opening below. This alignment matters because that drain hole is about to become your air intake and ash clearing access, exactly the way traditional hetsui stoves always had a small opening at the base for draft control. Step 4. Pack the clay mixture into the sink around your form pipe, working in layers, pressing firmly with your hands or a wooden paddle to remove air pockets as you go. Air pockets are the single biggest cause of cracking later because they create weak points that expand unevenly under heat. Build the clay wall up around the pipe to a thickness of at least 3 to 4 inches on all sides. Thinner than this, and the wall will not hold heat properly or survive repeated firing. Leave the top of the pipe open and level with or slightly below the top rim of the clay, and while the clay is still workable, carve or press a second opening near the top rim, off to one side, sized to fit a length of stovepipe for your chimney flue. A few feet of standard 6-inch stovepipe, another $15 to $25, angled so smoke draws upward and away properly. Step 5. Let it cure slowly, and I do mean slowly. This is the step where impatience destroys more homemade earthen stoves than any other mistake. Cover the wet clay loosely with a cloth or light tarp out of direct sun and rain, and let it air dry for a full week to 10 days before you ever introduce fire. Clay that dries too quickly, especially in direct sun, will crack from the outside in, and cracks in a firebox wall only grow larger with every use. My grandmother used to say, "The clay tells you when it is ready, not the calendar." But for those of you without her 50 years of reading a stove wall by touch, I will give you a clearer signal. Press your thumbnail firmly into the surface, in an inconspicuous spot. If it leaves only a faint mark and the surface feels cool and firm rather than damp and cold, it has cured enough to begin curing fires. Step 6. Cure it with fire gradually, the same way you cured it with air. Do not build a roaring fire on the first day. Start with a small handful of dry kindling. Burn it for perhaps 20 minutes. Let it go out completely, and let the stove rest and cool for a full day. Repeat this the next day with a slightly larger fire, and the day after with larger still. Over the course of about a week, you are slowly driving out the last of the internal moisture and allowing the clay to harden fully under gentle, increasing heat, exactly the way a potter fires a kiln in gradual stages rather than all at once. Skip this gradual curing and go straight to a full cooking fire on day 1, and I promise you, the thermal shock will crack that wall before it ever has the chance to prove how long it can truly last. Once fully cured, this stove is ready for real use. Cooking pots set directly over the firebox opening, a kettle for tea, even simple baking if you build a small clay dome extension later, which I may show you in a future video. And here is something remarkable about this build that surprises people every time. The cast iron sink shell, no longer touched directly by flame, simply holds its shape and radiates gentle warmth outward from the heated clay inside it, the way a good stone hearth radiates warmth into a room long after the fire itself has died down. That old sink, once destined for a landfill, is now doing the quiet, patient work of holding heat for your family, possibly for the rest of your life and beyond it. Now, the extra layers, the details almost nobody mentions, the ones that separate a stove that merely works from a stove that becomes a trusted, permanent part of your homestead. First, add a simple draft door at your ash and air intake opening, the one aligned with the old drain hole. A small piece of scrap sheet metal cut to size and hinged loosely or simply propped in place lets you control how much air feeds the fire. Pull it open for a hot, fast burn when cooking. Push it nearly closed to let a fire smolder low and slow overnight for gentle, steady heat. This single small addition, costing you nothing but a scrap of metal, gives you real control over your fuel use, and wasted fuel is wasted work, which Matainai never permits us to accept carelessly. Second overlooked detail, never let ash build up past a couple of inches inside the firebox. Ash insulates, and too much of it actually smothers a fire's airflow and reduces how efficiently it burns, wasting wood you worked hard to cut and split. Clear it every few uses through that same lower drain opening and save the ash. It is not waste at all. Sifted wood ash is precisely what goes into your next batch of clay mixture if you ever repair a crack or build a second stove, and it is also excellent worked into garden soil or a compost pile. Nothing here is thrown away. Everything has a second use waiting for it. Third, if you live somewhere with harder winters than mine, consider building a simple clay or stone hood extension above the stove's cooking opening, directing more heat and smoke efficiently into your chimney flue rather than out into the open air around your pot. This small addition, more clay and perhaps a little scrap sheet metal for the hood frame, meaningfully improves how much of your fire's heat actually goes into cooking your food rather than escaping uselessly into the yard. I want to tell you about my grandmother again, because this stove, more than almost anything else I build, carries her memory with every fire I light in it. Our family's Hetsui stove back in the village was older than my grandmother herself, built by her mother-in-law, repaired countless times over decades, patched with fresh clay whenever a crack appeared, never once replaced. I remember, as a small boy, watching my grandmother mix fresh clay and ash by hand to repair a hairline crack near the firebox mouth, working the paste in with her thumb the way you might work dough, humming quietly to herself. I asked her why we didn't just build a new stove, since ours was so old and cracked in places. She looked at me the way she always did when I asked a question that had an obvious answer to her but not yet to me, and said, "A stove that has fed 3 generations is not broken. It is simply asking for a little care." That single sentence has stayed with me my entire life, and I think of it every single time I patch a crack, rather than tear something down and start over. This is the heart of what I want you to carry away from today, more than the clay ratio or the stovepipe size. An old sink, discarded and forgotten, has just become something that will feed you, warm you, and outlast most manufactured stoves sold new today. Not because of some rare or expensive material, but because of patience, correct method, and a refusal to let something with good bones go to waste. This is what independence actually looks like on a homestead. It does not look dramatic. It looks like an old man packing clay into a chipped sink by hand, on an ordinary afternoon, quietly building something that his grandchildren may still be cooking on long after he is gone. Every stove like this, every tool repaired instead of replaced, every old material given new purpose, is one small refusal to depend entirely on a system that would much rather sell you something new every few years than let you build something that lasts a lifetime. That is not a small thing. That is dignity, built one careful layer of clay at a time. If you build this, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you are writing from, and tell me what old, forgotten piece sitting in your own yard or garage might be waiting for a second life like this one. I read every comment, even the short ones. And next time, I want to show you something my father taught me about joining wood without a single nail or screw. A method of traditional Japanese joinery so strong that entire farmhouses in my region have stood through 100 years of typhoons, using nothing else to hold their frames together. Until then, look twice before you throw something away. It may still have decades of good work left in it.